Nobody in the Great Hall of Accord had ever heard a single word silence an entire room before. Povil pressed his thin fingers against the recording tablet and watched the human delegation from behind his clerk's desk. He had been documenting council proceedings for 11 years and had seen hundreds of species walk through those massive doors. They always came with something. The Brevik brought ceremonial weapons to display strength. The Halani carried gifts of woven light. The Draenei, his own people, arrived with entourages of advisors and aides that filled half the chamber. But the humans brought nothing. 5 of them walked in wearing plain dark clothing, carrying no banners, no offerings, no displays of any kind. They moved quietly, their boots barely making sound on the polished stone floor, and took their seats without greeting anyone. Povil had read the files on humans before the session. The Draenei archives described them as aggressive, emotionally unstable, and dangerously short-lived. A species that burned through their brief existence with reckless ambition. He expected loud voices, dramatic gestures, threats. What he got instead was stillness. The man at the center of the human group was Roan Hadley. Middle-aged by human standards, with gray at his temples and lines around his eyes that suggested a life spent watching others very carefully. He sat with his hands folded on the table and his gaze resting somewhere in the middle distance, as if the enormous hall and its hundreds of alien delegates were simply not interesting enough to hold his attention. High Arbiter Mozhan opened the proceedings. The ancient tree-like figure stood at the central podium, his bark-covered limbs creaking as he raised his arms for silence. His voice was deep and slow, carrying the weight of centuries. We gather today to formalize peace between the Galactic Council and the species known as humanity, Mozhan said. 12 years have passed since the containment action. Both sides have suffered. It is time to move forward. Povil noticed how Mozhan called it a containment action rather than a war. The Council had always used softer language for what they had done to humanity. Delegate Cyril of the Draenei hegemony rose next. Tall, insectoid, with polished chitin that gleamed under the hall's lights, Cyril was the architect of the original campaign against Earth. He had pushed the Council to act when humanity began expanding into unclaimed space faster than any species in recorded history. Now he stood before the humans with practiced elegance, his mandibles clicking softly as he spoke. The Council, in its generosity, offers the following terms, Cyril began. He read from a formal document. Humanity would receive provisional membership in the Council. Their fleet would be reduced to purely defensive levels. They would pay reconstruction costs for damage caused during the war. Their expansion into new territory would be frozen at current borders for 50 standard years. Povil recorded every word. The terms were harsh, but not unusual. Most species accepted similar conditions after losing a conflict. The key word was provisional. It meant humanity would have a seat, but no real voice. They could observe council decisions, but not vote on them. For 50 years, they would be watched, contained, and controlled. Cyril finished reading and looked directly at Roan Hadley. The entire hall turned to the human delegation. Hundreds of eyes, some compound, some singular, some bioluminescent, all focused on the 5 quiet figures in dark clothing. Roan Hadley stood slowly. He looked at Cyril. He looked at Mozhan. He let his gaze travel across the hall, making eye contact with delegate after delegate. Then he said, "No." That was all. One word. He did not explain it. He did not soften it with diplomacy. He did not offer a counterproposal or ask for time to consider. He simply said no and sat back down. The silence lasted 4 full seconds. Povil counted because his recording tablet tracked time automatically. Then the hall exploded into noise. Delegates turned to each other, mandibles clicking, vocal sacs inflating, translation devices struggling to keep up with dozens of languages spoken at once. Cyril's chitin flushed dark with what Povil recognized as anger. High Arbiter Mozhan struck his podium 3 times with a heavy limb, calling for order. No species had ever rejected the first offer without a counterproposal. It was not done. The entire structure of council diplomacy was built on the exchange of terms, offer and counteroffer, back and forth until both sides found middle ground. Saying no and nothing else was not negotiation. It was something no one in the hall could categorize, and that made it terrifying. Mozhan called a recess. The delegates filed out in clusters, whispering and arguing. Povil watched the human delegation stand and leave through a side corridor. They moved at the same unhurried pace they had entered with. No tension in their shoulders, no frustration on their faces, just calm. Povil replayed the recording on his tablet. He watched Roan Hadley's face at the moment he spoke. There was nothing there. No anger, no satisfaction, no nervousness. The man had rejected the combined authority of the Galactic Council with less emotion than most beings use to order a meal. Cyril swept past Povil's desk without acknowledgement, his aide scrambling behind him. The Draenei delegate was already composing a revised offer in his mind. Povil could tell by the rapid clicking of his mandibles. Cyril believed this was a negotiation tactic, that the humans wanted better terms and would accept eventually. But Povil was not so sure. He had watched the way Roan Hadley looked at the hall. It was not the look of someone waiting for a better deal. It was the look of someone who had already decided exactly how this was going to end. That evening, in the bare human quarters on the station, Roan sat alone and typed a brief, encrypted message to General Darrow Fenn, hidden somewhere in deep space beyond the Dead Star. First offer was what we expected. They think we're desperate. We wait. He sent it and turned off the screen. Then he sat in the silence and let the Galactic Council worry. 3 days of silence from the human quarters made the council station feel like a place holding its breath. Povil noticed the change in the corridors. Delegates who normally walked with confidence now moved in tight groups, speaking in low voices. The Halani ambassador kept glancing toward the human section of the station as if expecting something to emerge from it. The Brevik military attaché had doubled his personal guard. Even the station's service staff, species from a dozen different worlds, seemed to sense the tension. Everyone was waiting for something, though nobody could say exactly what. Cyril spent those 3 days crafting a revised offer. Povil knew this because the Draenei delegate's aides came and went from his quarters at all hours, carrying documents and data tablets. Cyril was a meticulous strategist. He had built his career on reading other species and finding the precise point where their resistance broke. Every being had a price. Every species had a threshold. He simply needed to find humanity's. When the council reconvened, Cyril stood at the podium with the confidence of someone who had solved a difficult equation. His chiton was polished to a mirror finish. His voice carried warmth that Povil recognized as manufactured. The council has heard humanity's concern, Cyril said, as if a single-word rejection had been a detailed list of grievances. We offer revised terms in the spirit of mutual respect. The new offer raised the fleet cap. Humanity could maintain a larger defensive force. Reparations were cut by half. The expansion freeze was reduced from 50 years to 30. Cyril presented each change as if it were a profound sacrifice, pausing after each point to let the weight of his generosity settle on the room. Roan Hadley listened with the same unreadable expression he had worn 3 days earlier. When Cyril finished, the hall waited. Roan stood. No. He sat down. Cyril's mandibles stopped clicking. For a moment, the Draenei delegate simply stared at the human, his compound eyes fixed and unblinking. Then something shifted in his posture, a tightening that Povil recognized as the Draenei equivalent of rage barely contained. You reject again without explanation, Cyril said, his voice harder now. What does humanity want? Name your terms. This is how diplomacy functions. Roan did not stand again. He simply looked at Cyril and said nothing. It was Lien Ortiz who rose next. Roan's second-in-command was younger, with sharp eyes and a voice that cut cleanly through the hall's enormous space. She carried a small data tablet, but barely looked at it. The delegate asks what humanity wants, Lien said. Perhaps it would help if the council first understood what humanity lost. She began reading. Not demands, not terms. Facts. Colony world Breston. Population 112,000. Subjected to orbital bombardment in the 3rd month of the containment war. Civilian casualties, 41,000. Colony world New Haven. Population 89,000. Blockaded for 7 months. Starvation deaths 12,000. Transport vessel clarity, carrying 600 refugees, including children, destroyed by Draenei warships in what the Council's own records listed as a navigational error. Lien read for 8 minutes without raising her voice. Each number was delivered with the same flat precision. She did not add commentary. She did not describe the horror or the grief. She let the numbers speak. The hall was silent. Povel's fingers trembled slightly as he recorded the words. He had never heard these figures before. The Draenei archives contained no mention of civilian casualties during the containment war. The official record said the campaign was swift and surgical. What Lien described was something very different. Cyril interrupted twice, calling the figures unverified. Lien responded both times by citing the exact Council archive reference where the data was buried. It had been filed but never highlighted, never included in any summary. It existed in the system but had been deliberately forgotten. The third offer came 4 days later. This time it was not Cyril who presented it. 3 species, the Halani, the Mescari, and the Urdine, jointly proposed new terms. They acknowledged the war's cost to humanity. They included a vague statement of regret. But the fleet restrictions remained, softened but still present. Humanity would still be treated as a species on probation. Roan rejected ITWY now. Povel had begun researching humanity on his own time. The official Draenei files were thin and clearly biased. He dug deeper, accessing raw data from neutral species observation probes. What he found did not match the picture Cyril had painted 12 years ago when he convinced the Council that humans needed to be contained. Humans were short-lived, yes, but they adapted faster than any species in the records. In 200 years of space travel, they had colonized more worlds than the Draenei had in 1,000. Their technology was not superior, but they improved it at a rate that made projections almost meaningless. What they lacked in individual lifespan, they compensated for with an intensity of effort that the long-lived species of the Council could not match. The word Cyril had used 12 years ago was dangerous. But Povel, watching the human delegation move through the station corridors each evening in their quiet, unhurried way, began to think the more accurate word was patient. Humans could wait. And that, Povel realized, was what truly frightened the Council. Because every other species that had been offered peace had been eager to accept, desperate for the war to end, willing to take whatever terms were given just to stop the bleeding. Humanity was not desperate. They had survived the worst the Council could throw at them and come out the other side not broken, but steady. Behind closed doors that evening, Cyril told High Arbiter Mozhan that the humans were bluffing. No species could afford to reject peace forever. Eventually, the cost of isolation would force them to accept. Mozhan said nothing for a long time. Then he told Cyril that he had been reading the human history files, the real ones, not the Draenei summaries. They once fought among themselves for 30 years over religion, Mozhan said quietly. Another time, they held a siege for 900 days rather than surrender a single city. They do not bluff, delegate. They simply decide what they are willing to endure, and then they endure it. Cyril left the meeting in silence. Povel, stationed outside the door, saw the Draenei delegates chitin and had gone pale, the color it turned when a Draenei was not angry but afraid. The cracks appeared first in the hallways, not in the hall. Povel was carrying a stack of sealed transcripts to the archive vault when he saw them. 2 Halani diplomats standing outside the human delegation's quarters, speaking in hushed tones with Lien Ortiz. The Halani were tall, slender beings with skin that shifted color with their emotions. Right now, both of them were a deep, anxious blue. Povel walked past without stopping, but he slowed his steps enough to hear fragments. The Halani were offering to negotiate directly with humanity. A separate arrangement, outside the Council's framework. Something bilateral. Private, that be why the time Povel reached the archive, his mind was already turning. If the Halani were breaking ranks, the entire structure of the Council's united front was in danger. The Council's power had always rested on the principle that it spoke as one voice. Individual species did not make their own deals. That was the rule. That was the foundation. The humans were shaking that foundation without raising a single weapon. Within 2 days, it was not just the Halani. The Brevik sent their own representative, a gruff military officer named Commandant Hesk, to the human quarters. Povil saw him enter and emerge 40 minutes later looking troubled. Then the Erdene made contact. Then the Mescari Point 4 of the 5 species that had participated in the containment war were now trying to negotiate separately with the humans. Only the Draenei held firm, because Surul would not allow any of his people to approach the human delegation without his direct authorization. Roan Hadley listened to every private approach with the same calm patience. He thanked each delegation for their interest. He acknowledged their desire for resolution. And then he told them all the same thing. Humanity will only accept terms from the full council. We will not make separate arrangements. Povil expected the aliens to be relieved by this. Instead, they were terrified, because Roan's refusal to divide the council was far more dangerous than if he had accepted the individual deals. If he had taken bilateral agreements, the council could have framed it as human manipulation, a predatory species picking off weaker members. But by insisting that only the full council could grant peace, Roan was demanding something unprecedented, that the entire galactic governing body face humanity as equals, not as a defeated species, not as a contained threat. As equals, Surul understood this immediately. Povil watched the Draenei delegate spend an entire evening pacing his quarters, his aides dismissed, his mandibles clicking in the rapid rhythm that meant deep agitation. Surul had built his career on managing the council's hierarchy. He knew exactly what would happen if humanity was recognized as a full equal. It would mean admitting the containment war was not a justified action against a dangerous species. It would mean acknowledging that the war was an attack on a species that had done nothing wrong except grow too quickly. It would mean admitting Surul had lied. The Draenei delegate called an emergency session. Standing before the assembled council, his chitin polished, but his movements slightly too sharp to be calm, Surul made his proposal. The council should issue a formal ultimatum to humanity. Accept the most recent peace terms within 10 standard days, or face comprehensive economic and military sanctions. High Arbiter Mozhan received the proposal with visible discomfort. The ancient tree-like being shifted on his root legs, his bark creaking audibly. Mozhan had presided over the council for longer than most species could remember. He understood consequences in ways that shorter-lived beings could not. Sanctions, Mozhan said slowly, are what led to the war in the first place. Surul countered that the situation was different now. Humanity was isolated. Their fleet was smaller than the combined forces of the council. They had no allies outside the station. Economic pressure would force them to accept within weeks. The vote was held. The Halani abstained. The Brevik abstained. The Mescari voted against. But the Draenei, the Erdene, and 3 unaffiliated species voted in favor. The ultimatum passed by the narrowest possible margin. Povil recorded the vote count and felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had seen the records of what happened 12 years ago when the council tried to force humanity into submission. It had not gone the way anyone expected. That evening, Lien found Roan in the human quarters, standing by the narrow window that looked out at the dead star around which the station orbited. The star was a collapsed remnant, cold and dark, surrounded by a halo of radiation that made long-range scanning almost impossible. They passed the ultimatum, Lien said. I know. 10 days. I know. Lien sat down across from him. She was quieter than usual, and Roan could read the concern in her posture. If they follow through on sanctions, it could hurt the outer colonies, she said. People who are already struggling. Earth anticipated this step, Roan said. General Fenn is in position. Has been since before we arrived. Lien looked at him. How long have they been planning this? Since the ceasefire, Roan said. 12 years. Every offer they might make. Every response they might try. Earth has been preparing for this moment since the day the guns went quiet. Lien was silent for a while. Then she said, they really thought we would just accept whatever they gave us. Every species before us did, Roan said. That is what they cannot understand. They have never met a species that said no and meant it. Down in the lower levels of the station, Povil sat alone in the archive vault, surrounded by centuries of council records. He had pulled the original files on the containment war, the real ones buried under layers of classification. What he read made his hands shake. Cyril had not just advocated for the war. He had manufactured the justification. Falsified reports of human aggression, altered sensor data to show fleet movements that never happened, suppressed diplomatic communications from Earth that offered peaceful solutions. The war that killed tens of thousands of humans and shattered 2 colony worlds had been built on lies. And the same being who told those lies was now demanding the Council threaten humanity again. Povil closed the files and sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the hum of the station around him, wondering when the truth would finally matter more than power. The countdown changed everything. A massive display in the Great Hall of Accord now showed the remaining time on the ultimatum. 9 days, 14 hours, and 32 minutes, ticking down in the universal time standard used by all council species. It hung above the central podium like a threat carved in light, and every delegate who entered the hall glanced up at it before doing anything else. Cyril had wanted the display. He told Mozhan it would put pressure on the humans, remind them that time was not their ally. Mozhan had agreed reluctantly, but the effect was not what Cyril intended. Instead of pressuring the humans, the countdown was pressuring the council. Every delegate could see those numbers falling, and every delegate was asking the same question. What happens when it reaches 0? Nobody had a good answer on day 7. The council formally delivered the ultimatum in a full session. Cyril stood at the podium, flanked by representatives of the species that had voted in favor. The 4th offer was read aloud once more, barely changed from the 3rd. Fleet restrictions, limited expansion, a vague acknowledgement of the war's cost. Humanity would have 10 days from the original declaration, meaning 3 days remained. Cyril finished reading and turned to the human delegation. These are the Council's final terms. Acceptance will bring humanity into the galactic community. Rejection will result in full economic and military sanctions, effective immediately upon expiration of the deadline. The hall was packed. Every species with representation on the Council had sent observers. The viewing galleries above were full. Even the service staff had found reasons to be near the doors, listening. Roan Hadley stood. He looked at the countdown display overhead, then at Cyril, then at High Arbiter Mozhan. He took his time. When he spoke, his voice was clear and unhurried. Humanity thanks the Council for the deadline, he said. It clarifies things. A murmur ran through the hall. Cyril's mandibles clicked once, sharply. Humanity does not negotiate under threat. Roan continued. We did not start this war. We will not be punished for surviving it. We will not accept restrictions that no other council species faces. We will not pay for damage done to us. And we will not submit to a peace that treats us as criminals when we were victims. He paused. Your ultimatum is rejected. The hall erupted. Delegates rose from their seats. The brevet commandant slammed his fist against his desk. The Halani turned a violent shade of red. Cyril stood rigid, his chitin so dark it was nearly black. Only Mozhan remained still, gripping the podium with his heavy limbs, his ancient eyes fixed on the human diplomat. Roan did not sit down. He remained standing, letting the chaos wash over him like wind over stone. Leanne Ortiz watched from her seat, her face calm, but her eyes sharp. She had her hand resting casually near a small communication device concealed in her sleeve. She pressed it once. 90 minutes later, the first reports came in from the station's long-range sensor operators. A Mescari technician was the first to see it. She called her supervisor. The supervisor called the station's security chief. The security chief called Mozhan directly. There were ships in the dead star's radiation shadow. Not 1 or 2. Dozens. The sensor returns were faint, masked by the star's residual radiation, but unmistakable. Human warships, arranged in a formation that the brevet commandant immediately recognized as a defensive screen with offensive capability. They were not moving. They were not targeting anything. Their weapons were powered down. But they were there, and they had been there hidden for what the sensor analysts estimated was at least 2 weeks, since before the human delegation had even arrived at the station. Panic spread through the council in waves. The Erdene demanded an emergency session. The Mescari recalled their ambassador from the human quarters. The Halani's color shifted to a pale, terrified white. Cyril stood in his quarters receiving reports, his aides speaking over each other in rapid Draenei dialect. Even the Brevik, who prided themselves on military composure, were visibly shaken. General Darofin's fleet had been sitting in the shadow of the dead star the entire time, watching, waiting, and completely invisible to council sensors until the moment Lien Ortiz sent the signal to reveal themselves. Mozhan summoned Roan to a private chamber. The High Arbiter's bark skin was cracked in places Povil had never seen before, the physical sign of extreme stress in his species. His root legs trembled slightly as he stood. "Your fleet," Mozhan said. "Earth's fleet," Roan corrected gently. "They have been here the entire time." "Yes." Mozhan was quiet for a long moment. "Is this a threat, Mr. Hadley?" Roan shook his head. "If it were a threat, you would not have seen them. The fleet revealed itself because we want you to understand something. We came to this station prepared for every outcome. We hope for peace. We plan for everything else. Then what does humanity want?" Mozhan asked, and for the first time his ancient voice carried something very close to pleading. "Tell me plainly. No diplomacy. No positioning. What do your people actually want?" Roan looked at the High Arbiter. The old being's eyes were deep and tired, carrying the weight of centuries of decisions, not all of them good. "What every species wants, Arbiter," Roan said quietly. "A seat at the table, not a chain beneath it." Mozhan closed his eyes. The room was silent except for the distant hum of the station and the faint ticking of the countdown display echoing from the hall. When the High Arbiter opened his eyes, something had changed in them. Not fear, not anger, something closer to recognition. The look of a very old being who had finally seen clearly what had been in front of him the entire time. "I will speak to the council," Mozhan said. Roan nodded once, turned, and walked back to the human quarters. Behind him, the countdown continued its descent. But it no longer mattered. The numbers on the display were counting down to nothing, because the real negotiation had just begun. Cyril made his last move on the morning of Day 9, that he arrived at the emergency session carrying a sealed intelligence file that bore the highest classification the Draenei hegemony could assign. His chiton was polished, his posture erect, his voice steady. Whatever fear had crept into him over the past weeks was buried deep beneath the armor of a politician who had survived 40 years of galactic power games. Cyril was cornered, and cornered beings are dangerous, but they're also predictable. Povil watched from his recording desk as Cyril requested the floor. High Arbiter Mozhan granted it with visible reluctance. The hall was tense. The countdown display overhead read 1 day, 6 hours. The revelation of General Finn's hidden fleet had not faded from anyone's mind. Delegates sat in clusters defined by fear rather than alliance. The Halani had moved their seats away from the Draenei section entirely. Cyril opened the classified file and projected its contents onto the hall's central display. Sensor readings. Fleet Composition Analyse. Energy signatures from deep space monitoring stations. All of it pointed to one conclusion. Humanity, Cyril announced, is constructing a weapon of unprecedented destructive capacity. Our intelligence indicates a device capable of destabilizing stellar cores, effectively turning any star into a weapon. This is not a species seeking peace. This is a species preparing for conquest. The hall reacted with the shock Cyril intended. Gasped from the Erdene. A violent color shift in the Halani delegation. The Mescari ambassador rose half out of his seat. Even Mozhan leaned forward, his ancient bar creaking. Roan Hadley did not move. He sat in his chair with his hands folded, watching Cyril's presentation with the expression of someone observing weather. Cyril pressed forward. He called for an immediate military response. The hidden human fleet proved hostile intent. The superweapon intelligence proved humanity could not be trusted. The rejections of every peace offer proved they had never intended to negotiate in good faith. The council must act now, before it was too late. IT was a masterful performance. Searle's voice carried conviction. His data looked real. His argument flowed with the logic of fear, each piece supporting the next, building toward an inevitable conclusion. 12 years ago, a presentation very much like this one had convinced the council to launch the containment war, but 12 years ago, no one had challenged Searle's evidence. The Halani ambassador stood. She was tall even by Halani standards, her skin a controlled shade of calm green that Povil recognized as deliberately maintained. She had brought her own data tablet. The Halani Intelligence Service has been monitoring human space independently since the ceasefire, she said. We have detected no evidence of a stellar destabilization weapon, no unusual energy signatures, no construction facilities matching the profile Delegate Searle describes. She projected her own sensor data alongside Searle's. The discrepancies were immediate and obvious. Searle's readings showed energy signatures in regions where the Halani detected nothing. His fleet composition data listed ship types that the Halani's direct observation could not confirm. The Brevik Commandant stood next. Brevik long-range probes have been in the same sectors. We confirm the Halani findings. There is no weapon. Searle's chitin paled. The Mescari ambassador added their own independent intelligence to the growing wall of contradictions. Then the Urdine, who had voted in favor of the ultimatum, quietly submitted a report that their analysts had reviewed Searle's file overnight and found fabricated data signatures embedded in the sensor readings. The hall went very still. Mozhan turned to Searle. "Delegate," the High Arbiter said, his voice slow and heavy. "Is this intelligence genuine?" Searle's mandibles clicked rapidly. "The Drenai hegemony stands behind its analysis." "Then the Drenai hegemony stands alone," the Halani ambassador said. What followed was not an argument. It was an unraveling. With Searle's latest fabrication exposed, delegates began pulling at older threads. The Halani asked questions about the original intelligence that justified the containment war. The Brevik demanded access to the raw data behind Searle's 12-year-old threat assessments. The Mescari pointed out inconsistencies in the Council's official war record that they had noticed years ago but never raised publicly. Povil's hands moved across his recording tablet in a blur. He was documenting the disintegration of a narrative that had defined galactic politics for over a decade. Every question led to another. Every answer revealed a gap. And in every gap, Searle's fingerprints were visible. The containment war had been built on lies. The threat assessments were manipulated. The diplomatic communications from Earth, the ones offering peaceful solutions, had been intercepted and suppressed by Drenai intelligence. The sensor data showing human aggression had been altered. Humanity had never been the threat Searle claimed. They had simply been growing, expanding, thriving in ways that made the Drenai feel small. During a recess, Leanne Ortiz walked past Povil's desk. She stopped, looked at the clerk's recording tablet, and saw the meticulous transcript of everything that had just been said. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for keeping accurate records." Povil looked up at her, startled. In 11 years of clerking for the Council, no delegate or diplomat from any species had ever acknowledged his existence. "The truth needs a witness," Leanne said. "That is all we ever wanted. Not revenge, not dominance, just the truth, spoken in a room where it mattered." She walked away. Povil watched her go and then looked back at his tablet. The transcript was thousands of words long, documenting the moment an empire's lies finally collapsed under their own weight. That evening, Mozhan summoned Searle to a private meeting. Povil was stationed outside, close enough to hear the High Arbiter's voice through the heavy door. "The Drenai hegemony will face a formal inquiry," Mozhan said. "Your intelligence files, all of them, will be reviewed. If you destroy the Drenai's reputation," Searle said, his voice tight, "you destabilize the entire Council. We are one of the founding species. Without us, the structure collapses." Mozhan's response was quiet but carried the weight of centuries. "You destabilized it 12 years ago, Delegate, when you started a war based on lies. The Council survived before the Drenai shaped it. It will survive after." The door opened. Cyril emerged. His chitin was the pale color of fear, and for the first time his compound eyes would not meet anyone's gaze. He walked past Povil without a word, his age trailing behind in silence. Povil watched him go and thought about the 5 humans in their bare quarters who had carried no gifts, no displays, no weapons into this station. They had carried only the patience to wait until the truth spoke for itself. The countdown display had been turned off. Povil noticed it when he entered the great hall for the final session. The massive numbers that had loomed over every meeting for the past 10 days were gone, replaced by the hall's original lighting, a soft amber glow designed centuries ago to make all species feel equally at ease. It was a small change, but it meant everything. The ultimatum was dead. The threats were over. What happened next would be something new. The hall was full but quiet. Delegates sat in their assigned positions, but the rigid formations of previous sessions had softened. The Halani had moved closer to the center. The brevet commandant sat with his arms uncrossed for the first time Povil could remember. Even the Erdene, who had spent most of the proceedings looking uncomfortable, appeared settled. Only the Drenai section felt different. Cyril was present, seated in his formal position, but his aides were fewer and his posture carried none of the authority it once had. He looked diminished, like a structure that had lost its foundation. High Arbiter Mozhan took the podium. The ancient being moved slowly, his root legs careful on the polished floor. He had presided over this council for longer than most species had records, and Povil could see the exhaustion in every crack of his bark skin. But his eyes were clear. Whatever decision he had reached, he had made it with full awareness. This council has spent weeks attempting to dictate terms to humanity, Mozhan said. His voice filled the hall, low and resonant. We have made 4 formal offers. Each was rejected. We issued an ultimatum. It was rejected. We presented intelligence that has since been revealed as fabricated. He paused, letting the words sit in the silence. In all of this, humanity has not once raised its voice, has not once threatened this body, has not once demanded anything. They have simply said no and waited. I confess that I did not understand this at first. I interpreted it as stubbornness or pride, or perhaps a negotiation tactic more sophisticated than anything we had encountered. Mozhan looked directly at the human delegation. I was wrong. Humanity was not negotiating. They were waiting for us to see what they already knew, that every offer we made was not peace. It was control by another name, and no species should accept that. The hall was absolutely still. Povil's fingers hovered over his tablet, recording every word. For the first time in the history of this council, Mozhan continued, I am asking a species to present its own terms for peace. Mr. Hadley, the floor is yours. Rowan Hadley stood. He looked the same as he had on the first day, plain dark clothing, gray at his temples, lines around his eyes. He carried no document, no tablet, no prepared speech. He walked to the center of the hall and stood where every delegate could see him clearly. Humanity's terms are simple, Rowan said. Full and equal membership in the Galactic Council, with the same rights, the same vote, and the same standing as any founding species. No fleet restrictions beyond those that apply equally to all member worlds. No reparations from either side. A joint investigation into the origins of the containment war, conducted by a neutral panel with full access to all classified records. And a formal, public acknowledgement that humanity did not start the conflict. He stopped. The hall waited for more. For demands of territory. For economic concessions. For the kind of punitive terms that victorious species always imposed on those who had wronged them. Nothing more came. Rowan stood in the silence and let the simplicity of it settle over the room. Humanity was not asking for revenge, not asking for dominance, not asking for anything that any fair-minded being could call unreasonable. They wanted equality, just equality, nothing more and absolutely nothing less. The Halani ambassador spoke first. These terms are acceptable to the Halani collective. The brevet commandant nodded once, sharply. The brevet accord agrees. The Mescari followed. Then the Erdene. One by one, species that had fought against humanity 12 years ago, or stood by while others did, rose and accepted terms that asked nothing of them except fairness. Cyril voted against. His voice was steady when he said it, but his chitin was pale and his mandibles did not click. He was a figure going through emotion that had already lost all meaning. The vote passed overwhelmingly. The signing took place that afternoon in a small chamber adjacent to the Great Hall. It was brief and without ceremony. Mozhan affixed the council's seal. Roan signed for Earth. Each supporting species added their mark. There were no speeches, no celebrations, no grand gestures. The document was filed. The war was over. Humanity was equal. Povel was the last to leave the signing chamber. He had stayed to verify every record, cross-reference every signature, ensure that every word was preserved exactly as spoken. It was his job, and he took it seriously. But as he gathered his tablets, he found himself standing in the corridor near the human quarters. Roan Hadley was there, waiting for the rest of his delegation to finish packing. He stood by the narrow window that looked out at the dead star, his hands at his sides, his face carrying the same unreadable calm it had worn since the day he arrived. Povel approached him. He did not know exactly why. Perhaps it was because no one else would ask, and the question had been living in his mind since the first session. "Mr. Hadley," Povel said, "may I ask you something?" Roan looked at him. He seemed unsurprised. Of course. Through all of this, weeks of rejection, the ultimatum, the threats, you never made a counteroffer. Not once. Why? Roan studied the small Drenai clerk for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the closest thing to warmth Povel had seen from him. "Because a counteroffer means you accept the other side's framework," Roan said. "It means you agree that their starting point is legitimate and you are just haggling over the details. We did not come here to negotiate within their rules. We came to change the rules." Povel recorded this in his personal notes, not in the official transcript. Some things belong to the moment, not to history that he watched the human delegation leave the station the same way they had arrived. 5 people in plain dark clothing, carrying nothing, walking quietly through corridors that had hosted centuries of galactic power. They did not look back. They did not wave or bow or acknowledge the dozens of alien eyes watching them from doorways and windows. They just walked, steady and unhurried, through the airlock and into their waiting ship behind them. The Great Hall of Accord stood empty for the first time in weeks. The countdown display was dark. The podium was bare. The seats where hundreds of delegates had argued and feared and slowly, painfully learned to see clearly were vacant. Somewhere in the radiation shadow of the dead star, General Finn's fleet powered down its engines and slipped away into the void. No weapons had been fired. No shots exchanged. No blood spilled in the corridors of the ancient station. Humanity had won its place among the stars with nothing but silence, patience, and a truth so simple it had taken the entire galaxy weeks to hear it. They had never wanted to be feared. They had only wanted to be equal. And that, in the end, was what frightened the galaxy most of all.